Wyoming Territory, 1885. Miles from the nearest town, across vast stretches of untamed prairie, a solitary figure guided his horse along a worn trail as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land. Dust clung to the leather of his boots, and his weathered Stetson bore the marks of years under the western sky. At 25, Declan Burke had already seen enough of the frontier to know one immutable truth. A man survived out here by relying on no one but himself. The West had taught Declan early that attachment was a luxury he couldn't afford. His parents' homestead, like so many others, had fallen to drought and disease when he was barely 16. Since then, he drifted from ranch to ranch, trading his skills with horse and rope for modest pay, keeping his connections shallow and temporary. The life of a cowhand suited him, moving on before roots could take hold, before people could become important enough to lose. No sense in finding something worth caring about in this country, he often told himself. The land or the Indians or the outlaws will just take it from you anyway. As Declan crested a hill overlooking the small settlement of Cottonwood Springs, he paused to survey the cluster of buildings that comprised the town. His gaze lingered on the white steeple of the church, where a small gathering of people milled about. Something was happening, something festive by the looks of the decorations and fine clothes. A wedding, perhaps. Declan had been hired by William Carson, owner of the Rocking Sea Ranch outside town, to help with spring branding. The job would last a few weeks, then he'd move on as always. That was the pattern that kept him safe, kept him from the pain of loss that seemed to be the only guarantee the frontier offered. He nudged his horse forward. Supplies first, then the ranch. The sooner he started, the sooner he could finish and be on his way. As Declan approached the church, the commotion grew more distinct. This was no celebration. The crowd's mood was tense, voices raised in confusion and gossip. Women clustered in concerned groups while men stood with arms crossed, shaking their heads. Disgraceful business. An older man in a fine suit muttered as Declan rode past. Poor girl, a woman in a flowered bonnet replied. Left standing there in her wedding dress with everyone watching. Declan didn't slow his horse. Other people's troubles weren't his concern. He'd learned long ago that minding his own business kept him out of harm's way. Still, he couldn't help but glance toward the church steps. That's when he saw her. She stood alone on the church steps, a vision in white, her dark chestnut hair arranged with tiny white flowers that matched her dress. Even from this distance, Declan could see the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she held her head high despite the tears that streamed down her face. Something about her posture, proud even in humiliation, made him rein his horse to a stop. The bride couldn't have been more than 22, with delicate features and skin kissed by the western sun. Her wedding dress, clearly sewn with care, billowed gently in the Wyoming breeze. But it was her eyes that caught him, deep, expressive, and filled with a storm of emotions that spoke of betrayal and wounded dignity. Before Declan realized what he was doing, he had dismounted and was approaching the church. He told himself he was just curious, that he'd watch for a moment and continue on his way. Then those eyes met his. Olivia James had imagined this day 1,000 times since Samuel had proposed last autumn. The son of the most successful merchant in the territory, Samuel Porter had courted her properly, charmed her father, and promised her a life of comfort and respect. At 22, with no prospect of inheritance from her struggling farmer father, she'd considered herself fortunate. Now she stood alone before the entire community, abandoned by the man who had sworn to love and protect her until death. The whispers of the crowd cut like knives. Some pitied her, others speculated what she might have done to drive him away. Nobody knew the truth, that Samuel had fled with his family's cash box and the daughter of the saloon owner, leaving only a hastily scrawled note explaining he'd never truly loved Olivia. I will not break, she whispered to herself, though her heart felt shattered beyond repair. I will not give them the satisfaction of seeing me collapse. Through the blur of her tears, she noticed a stranger watching her, a young cowboy who hadn't been part of the wedding party. Tall and lean, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and eyes the color of a summer sky, he stood apart from the gossiping crowd. Unlike the others, his expression held no judgment, only a quiet curiosity and perhaps a hint of admiration. For reasons Olivia couldn't understand, meeting his steady gaze steadied her. She took a deep breath and descended the church steps, ignoring the reaching hands and sympathetic clucks of the townswomen. She needed to escape, to find somewhere to gather the tattered remnants of her dignity in private. As she passed the stranger, their eyes met again. Up close, she could see he was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw lightly covered in stubble and sun-weathered skin that spoke of a life spent outdoors. He couldn't have been much older than her, though his eyes carried a wariness that made him seem older. "Miss," he said simply, tipping his hat. Something in his voice, respectful but without the cloying pity of the others, made her pause. "It seems I'm not to be married today after all," she said with forced lightness, surprised at her own candor with this stranger. His lips curved slightly. "Their loss is my greatest fortune." The words were spoken so softly that Olivia wasn't certain she'd heard correctly. Before she could respond, her father appeared at her side, his weathered face creased with concern and embarrassment. "Come, Olivia," he said gently. "Let's get you home." As her father led her away, Olivia glanced back once. The cowboy still watched her, standing straight and tall amid the chaos she'd left behind. For the first time since discovering Samuel's betrayal, Olivia felt something other than humiliation and grief. A flicker of curiosity about the stranger whose eyes held no judgment, only quiet respect. Declan couldn't explain why he'd spoken to the jilted bride. Such an action defied all his rules about keeping to himself. Yet something about her courage in the face of public humiliation had compelled him to acknowledge her strength. "Their loss is my greatest fortune." The words had slipped out unbidden, surprising even himself. What had possessed him to say such a thing to a complete stranger, particularly one who'd just suffered such a public rejection? He shook his head, mounting his horse and continuing toward the general store. The sooner he got out to the rocking sea, the sooner he could forget the woman with the proud posture and tear-stained face. 2 hours later, as he rode through the gates of the ranch, Declan had almost convinced himself that the encounter meant nothing. Carson greeted him at the bunkhouse, a barrel-chested man with a booming voice who quickly explained the operation and introduced him to the other hands. "We'll start branding tomorrow at first light," Carson said. "Tonight, get some rest. Oh, and one more thing. My niece is staying with us for a while. Family troubles. She'll be taking meals at the main house with us, so mind your manners if you see her." Declan nodded, unconcerned. He rarely interacted with the women of the ranches where he worked, preferring to keep his relationships simple and professional. The next morning broke clear and cold. Declan rose before dawn, joining the other hands for a quick breakfast before heading out to gather the first herd for branding. The work was hard but familiar, roping calves, holding them down, enduring their frightened bellowing as the hot iron pressed against their flanks. By midday, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and his muscles ached pleasantly from the exertion. As the men paused for a brief meal, Carson's wife appeared at the corral fence. "William, your niece is here," she called. Declan glanced up idly, then froze. Walking beside Mrs. Carson was the bride from the church steps, now dressed in a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back in a practical braid. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, and he saw recognition flash in her expression. "Gentlemen," Carson announced, "this is my niece, Olivia James. She'll be staying with us indefinitely." Olivia nodded politely to the assembled cowboys, but her gaze returned to Declan. A small, wry smile touched her lips. "It seems we meet again," she said quietly when Carson introduced them. "Miss James," Declan replied, touching the brim of his hat. That evening, as the hands gathered for supper in the bunkhouse, Declan found himself unusually distracted. The other men discussed the humiliating situation of Carson's niece being abandoned at the altar, but Declan remained silent. He'd seen the strength in her eyes, the determination beneath her pain. There was more to Olivia James than a woman scorned, and for the first time in years, Declan felt curious about another person's story. For 3 days, Declan managed to avoid more than passing encounters with Olivia. He threw himself into the work, volunteering for the most distant pastures and the longest hours. Each time he caught sight of her across the yard or heard her voice from the main house porch, something unsettled stirred inside him, a feeling he couldn't name and didn't welcome. On the 4th day, as Declan worked alone mending a broken section of fence, a shadow fell across the ground beside him. He looked up to find Olivia standing there, holding a canteen. "Aunt Martha thought you might be thirsty," she said, offering the water. It's getting warm today. Thank you, Miss James. Declan accepted the canteen, careful not to let their fingers touch. Instead of leaving, Olivia leaned against a fence post, watching him work. The silence stretched between them until she finally spoke. You're the only person who hasn't asked me about what happened at the church. Declan hammered a nail into place before answering. Not my business to ask. Everyone else seems to think it's theirs, she said with a hint of bitterness. Even the hands whisper when they think I can't hear. Declan set down his hammer and met her gaze directly. People talk. It doesn't mean you have to listen. Is that your philosophy, Mr. Burke? Don't listen to people. Generally, I try not to be around people enough to hear them talk at all. This drew a genuine laugh from her, a warm, unexpected sound that caught him off guard. My uncle says you're the best hand with horses he's seen in years, but you'll likely move on as soon as branding season ends. Declan returned to his work. That's the arrangement. Do you ever stay anywhere long enough to call it home? The question pierced something vulnerable inside him. Home is a luxury for people with deeper roots than mine, Miss James. After what happened, I'm not sure I have any roots left myself, she admitted quietly. Declan paused, studying her. The proud woman from the church steps was still there, but now he could see the uncertainty beneath her composure. Without thinking, he said, sometimes losing what you thought you wanted leads you to something better. Olivia's eyes widened slightly. Is that what happened to you? Declan immediately regretted his words. He was getting too personal, breaking his own cardinal rule. I should finish this section before sundown. She nodded, recognizing his withdrawal. Of course. Keep the canteen. You can return it later. As she walked away, Declan forced himself to focus on the fence. Yet his eyes drifted to her retreating figure, and an unfamiliar sensation settled in his chest. The first stirrings of connection he'd allowed himself to feel in years. That night, as he lay in his bunk listening to the snores of the other hands, Declan found himself replaying their conversation. Olivia James was dangerous, not because she was a jilted bride or the boss's niece, but because something about her made him want to lower the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself. This will pass, he assured himself. Everything in this life is temporary. But even as he thought it, a small voice inside questioned whether that was truly what he wanted anymore. The following week brought cattle rustlers to the western range of the rocking sea. Carson gathered the hands, assigning them to armed patrols to protect the herd. Declan found himself paired with an older cowboy named Frank for the night watch. As they rode along the perimeter in the silver moonlight, Frank broke the companionable silence. You know, the boss's niece has been asking questions about you. Declan kept his expression neutral. That's so. Wanted to know where you came from, how long you've been riding for the rocking sea. Seemed mighty interested for a woman who just got her heart broken. She's probably just making conversation to distract herself. Frank chuckled. Maybe. Or maybe she sees something in you worth asking about. Before Declan could respond, a flash of movement caught his eye. He raised a hand, signaling Frank to be quiet, and pointed toward a cluster of trees where shadows moved against the moonlight. Rustlers, Frank whispered. 4, maybe 5 of them. Ride back to the ranch, Declan instructed. Get Carson and the others. I'll keep an eye on them. You shouldn't stay alone. Go, Declan insisted. I'll keep my distance. Once Frank had disappeared into the night, Declan guided his horse closer to the rustlers, careful to stay downwind. He counted 5 men cutting several calves from the herd. They worked with practiced efficiency, suggesting this wasn't their first theft. Declan knew he should wait for reinforcements, but the rustlers were already moving the separated calves toward a narrow pass that would make them difficult to track. Making a split-second decision, he drew his revolver and urged his horse forward. That's far enough, he called, his voice carrying in the still night air. Those animals belong to the rocking sea. The rustlers turned as one, reaching for their weapons. Declan fired a warning shot into the air. Next one won't miss. Leave the cattle and ride out. For a moment, it seemed they might comply. Then the largest of the men snarled. There's only one of him, boys, and fired. The bullet whistled past Declan's ear as he ducked and returned fire. His shot found its mark, sending one rustler tumbling from his saddle with a cry. The night erupted into chaos, gunfire, shouting, the panicked lowing of cattle. Declan took cover behind a boulder, trading shots with the remaining rustlers. A bullet grazed his arm, sending a flare of pain through his shoulder but he held his position. If he could just hold them off until Carson and the others arrived. Suddenly, hoofbeats thundered behind him. Relief flooded through Declan as he glanced back, expecting to see Carson and his men. Instead, a lone rider emerged from the darkness. Olivia, her hair streaming behind her, Carson's rifle clutched in her hands. "What the hell are you doing here?" Declan shouted as she dismounted and crouched beside him. "I heard the shots," she replied, her face pale but determined in the moonlight. "Frank and the others are still 10 minutes behind. You need to get back to the ranch. Now." Olivia's jaw set stubbornly. "I grew up on a farm, Mr. Burke. I can shoot." As if to prove her point, she raised the rifle, took aim at a rustler attempting to flank their position, and fired. The man yelped and fell back, clutching his leg. Declan stared at her in disbelief. This woman, who a week ago had stood abandoned in her wedding dress, was now fearlessly facing down armed rustlers. "You're bleeding," she noted, nodding toward his arm. "Just a scratch." Together they held the rustlers at bay until the thunder of approaching horses announced Carson's arrival. The remaining thieves fled into the night, leaving their wounded companion and the stolen cattle behind. As Carson and his men secured the rustler and gathered the scattered herd, Declan turned to Olivia. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen." "Perhaps a bit of both," she admitted, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. "When I heard the shots, I couldn't just wait at the ranch wondering if—" She stopped abruptly. "If what?" Declan prompted. Olivia met his gaze directly. "If you were hurt. Or worse." Something shifted between them in that moment. A recognition that whatever was growing between them had already taken root, despite Declan's determination to remain unattached. Carson approached, his expression thunderous. "Olivia James, what in God's name were you thinking, riding out here alone in the middle of the night?" "She saved my life," Declan interrupted. "If she hadn't shown up when she did, those rustlers would have flanked me for certain." Carson looked from one to the other, his anger slowly giving way to bewilderment. "Well," he finally said, "let's get you both back to the ranch and tend to that arm." As they rode back side by side, Olivia spoke quietly. "Thank you for defending me to Uncle William. I only spoke the truth." Still, most men wouldn't acknowledge being helped by a woman. Declan considered this. "I learned long ago that pride is a luxury that can get you killed out here. You showed up when I needed help. That's worth acknowledging. Is that why you move from place to place? Because you don't want to need anyone's help?" The question cut closer to the truth than Declan cared to admit. "It's simpler that way." "Simpler, perhaps," Olivia said thoughtfully. "But lonelier too, I imagine." Back at the ranch, as Mrs. Carson cleaned and bandaged Declan's arm, Olivia remained by his side, her presence both comforting and unsettling. When she finally retired to the main house, Carson offered Declan a glass of whiskey. "My niece is not usually so reckless," the rancher said, settling into a chair across from him. "She's braver than most men I've known," Declan replied. Carson studied him over the rim of his glass. "She's had a difficult time. That coward Porter humiliated her in front of the entire county. The gossip has been merciless. She doesn't seem broken by it." "No, she doesn't," Carson agreed. "But she is vulnerable, even if she hides it well." He fixed Declan with a pointed look. "I've noticed how she watches you, Burke, and how you watch her when you think no one's looking." Declan stiffened. "I've done nothing improper, sir. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just saying, be careful with her heart. It's been damaged enough already." Carson stood, clapping Declan on his uninjured shoulder. "And maybe consider that running isn't always the answer." Over the next 2 weeks, as spring blossomed across the Wyoming range, something else blossomed between Declan and Olivia. Their encounters grew more frequent. Chance meetings by the corral, shared moments on the porch at dusk, conversations that stretched longer each time. Declan found himself lingering at tasks near the main house, making excuses to be where Olivia might pass by. For her part, she seemed to find endless reasons to visit the stables or bring messages to the hands in the field. One evening, as sunset painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and golds, Declan found Olivia sitting alone on a fallen log near the creek that ran through the property. He hesitated, then approached. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She smiled, making room beside her. "I was hoping you might find me here." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the water flow past. Uncle William says the branding is almost finished, Olivia finally said. You'll be moving on soon. Declan nodded, though the thought brought none of the usual relief. That's the arrangement. Where will you go? Montana, maybe. There's always work for a hand who knows horses. Olivia traced patterns in the dirt with a stick. I've been thinking about leaving too. Starting fresh somewhere people don't look at me with pity or whisper behind my back. Declan turned to study her profile, gilded by the fading sunlight. Is that what you want? To leave? I don't know what I want anymore, she admitted. I thought I knew. A husband, a home, children. But now, she looked up, meeting his gaze. Now I wonder if I was settling for what was expected rather than what might make me truly happy. And what would make you truly happy, Olivia James? Declan asked softly. I think, she began, then paused, gathering her courage. I think I'd like to find someone who sees me for who I am, not what I represent. Someone who wouldn't leave me standing alone when things got difficult. The vulnerability in her voice touched something deep inside Declan, cracking the walls he'd built around his heart. Before he could stop himself, he reached out and covered her hand with his. Samuel Porter was a fool, he said, his voice low and intense. Any man would be lucky to stand beside you, in good times and bad. Olivia's eyes widened at his touch, but she didn't pull away. Even you, Declan Burke? The man who never stays anywhere long enough to put down roots. The question hung between them, challenging and hopeful all at once. Declan knew what his answer should be, a gentle withdrawal, a reminder that his life didn't allow for attachments. Yet looking into Olivia's eyes, he found himself wanting, for the first time in years, to consider another path. I've spent a long time believing that caring for people only leads to pain, he admitted. That the only way to survive out here is to rely on no one but yourself. And now, she prompted when he fell silent. Now I'm not so sure anymore. He gestured to his healing arm. You rode into gunfire to help a man you barely knew. That kind of courage, it makes me question everything I thought I understood about surviving out here. Olivia's fingers tentatively intertwined with his. Perhaps true survival isn't about avoiding pain or attachment. Perhaps it's about finding someone to face the hardships with. The truth of her words resonated through him, challenging years of carefully constructed defenses. Before he could respond, a distant call broke the moment. Olivia? Supper's ready. Mrs. Carson's voice carried from the main house. Reluctantly, Olivia withdrew her hand and stood. I should go. Declan nodded, remaining seated. Olivia, he called as she turned to leave. Would you ride with me tomorrow? There's a place up in the hills I'd like to show you. Her smile lit something warm inside him. I'd like that very much. As Declan watched her walk away, he recognized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. For the first time since losing his family's homestead, the thought of moving on brought no comfort, only an ache at the prospect of leaving Olivia behind. The next day dawned clear and perfect, with a gentle breeze tempering the spring sunshine. Declan saddled 2 horses after the morning chores, his heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm of anticipation. When Olivia appeared wearing a simple riding dress and boots, her hair braided down her back, he felt a surge of admiration that went beyond her physical beauty. Ready for an adventure, Miss James? He asked, helping her mount. Lead the way, Mr. Burke, she replied with a playful smile that transformed her face. They rode for nearly an hour, climbing steadily into the foothills beyond the ranch. Declan had discovered the spot during his first week at the Rocking Sea while tracking strays, a natural clearing overlooking the valley, where wildflowers carpeted the ground and a small waterfall tumbled into a crystal pool. When they reached the clearing, Olivia gasped in delight. It's beautiful. How did you find this place? Declan helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. I've always had a knack for finding the quiet corners of wherever I am, places where a man can think. And what do you think about up here, all alone? She asked, wandering toward the edge of the clearing to gaze out at the vista below. Declan hesitated, then decided on honesty. Lately, I've been thinking about you. Olivia turned, her expression softening. Have you? More than is sensible for a drifting cowhand. She approached him slowly. And what conclusions have you reached in all this thinking? That you're unlike any woman I've ever known. Declan swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. And that the thought of riding away from here, from you, sits heavier on me than I expected. A delicate flush rose in Olivia's cheeks. Then perhaps you shouldn't ride away. It's not that simple, he said, turning to secure the horses to a nearby tree. I'm not the kind of man who can offer security or comfort. I've got no land, no prospects beyond my next job. Is that what you think I want? Security and comfort? There was a hint of frustration in her voice that made him turn back to face her. Isn't it what any sensible woman would want? Olivia shook her head. I thought I wanted those things with Samuel. He offered a fine house in town, respectability, a comfortable life. But there was no passion in it, no real connection. I convinced myself it was enough. Her eyes met his, unflinching. I was wrong. What do you want then? Declan asked, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. I want someone who sees my strength, not just my vulnerability. Someone who respects my mind as well as my heart. She took a step closer. Someone who makes me feel alive, not merely secure. The intensity in her eyes stole Declan's breath. They stood so close now that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair. Someone like you, Declan Burke, she finished softly. The last of his resistance crumbled. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, but when Olivia's arms wound around his neck, it deepened into something that awakened every dormant feeling inside him. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Declan rested his forehead against hers. This changes everything, he murmured. Good, she replied simply. They spent the day in the clearing, sharing a simple picnic lunch Olivia had packed, and talking more openly than either had in years. Declan told her about losing his family's homestead, about the years of drifting from ranch to ranch, protecting himself from attachment. Olivia shared her doubts about Samuel even before the wedding, her fear of disappointing her father, her dream of a life more adventurous than what the merchant's son had offered. As the afternoon waned, Declan found himself considering possibilities he'd never allowed before, staying, building something permanent, allowing himself to need someone else. We should head back before your uncle sends a search party, he said reluctantly as the sun began its descent. On the ride back to the ranch, a comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated by shared glances and subtle smiles. This newfound connection felt both terrifying and right, like discovering a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. Their peaceful bubble burst the moment they rode into the ranch yard. Carson stood on the porch, his expression grave, speaking with a stranger in a smart Eastern suit. At the sight of the horses approaching, both men turned. The blood drained from Olivia's face. Samuel, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Declan tensed, instinctively moving his horse closer to hers. Your former fiancé? She nodded, her hands tightening on the reins until her knuckles whitened. Samuel Porter stepped forward as they dismounted, his handsome face set in a contrite expression that Declan immediately mistrusted. Olivia, thank God, Porter said, approaching with outstretched hands. I've been half out of my mind looking for you. Olivia remained beside Declan, her posture rigid. What are you doing here, Samuel? I've come to make things right, of course. Porter glanced dismissively at Declan before refocusing on Olivia. Could we speak privately? Please. Anything you have to say to me can be said here, Olivia replied coolly. Porter's expression hardened slightly before smoothing into practiced charm. Very well. I made a terrible mistake, Olivia. I panicked, convinced myself I wanted something I didn't. But I've come to my senses now. He took another step forward. I want us to try again. My parents are willing to overlook this indiscretion and welcome you into the family properly. Declan felt Olivia stiffen beside him. The word indiscretion hung in the air, assigning blame where none belonged. Your indiscretion, Samuel, she corrected, her voice steady despite the tension Declan could feel radiating from her. You abandoned me at the altar. You ran away with another woman and your family's money. Porter had the grace to look embarrassed. A momentary madness, nothing more. Clara meant nothing to me. I left her in Denver and came straight back when I realized my mistake. He reached for Olivia's hand. Please, Olivia, we can still have the life we planned. Before she could answer, Carson stepped forward, his expression thunderous. The life you planned? You humiliated my niece in front of the entire county, boy. You broke her heart and her trust. What makes you think you deserve a second chance? With all due respect, Mr. Carson, this is between Olivia and me, Porter replied stiffly. Our families have already discussed the matter. Her father agrees that a quiet ceremony would be best to put this unfortunate situation behind us. Declan felt as though he'd been struck. Her father had agreed? He looked at Olivia, whose face had gone pale. My father agreed to this, she asked, her voice small. Porter nodded. He's practical enough to see that this is still the best match for you. The Porters are the most established family in the territory. We can give you a life of comfort and respect. Declan took a step back, the familiar coldness of detachment seeping through him. Of course her father would want her to marry Porter. What could Declan offer that would compare to the security of the territory's wealthiest family? I think you should hear him out, Declan said quietly to Olivia, ignoring the pang in his chest. This is the kind of opportunity that doesn't come twice. Olivia turned to him, disbelief and hurt flashing in her eyes. You think I should consider his offer? I think you should consider what's best for your future, he replied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. A merchant's son can give you things a drifting cowhand never could. Without waiting for her response, Declan handed his horse's reins to a stable boy and walked away, each step an exercise in restraint. Behind him, he heard Carson call his name, but he didn't turn back. The walls around his heart, momentarily lowered, slammed back into place with crushing force. He had allowed himself to forget, just for a day, the fundamental truth of his existence. Men like him didn't get happy endings. They got survival, nothing more. Dreaming of anything else was a fool's game. In the bunkhouse, Declan began gathering his few possessions. The other hands watched in silence, aware something significant had transpired, but wise enough not to ask. Going somewhere, Burke? Frank finally ventured. Branding's done, Declan replied shortly. Time to move on. Without saying goodbye to the boss. Or his niece. Declan's hands stilled for a moment before continuing to roll his spare shirt into his saddlebag. Better this way. Frank shook his head. You know, for a smart man, you can be awfully stupid sometimes. Meaning what? Meaning I saw how that girl looked at you when you walked away just now. Like you'd gutted her clean through. Frank crossed his arms. And I'm guessing you're running because you're afraid of what she makes you feel. Declan straightened, anger flaring. You don't know what you're talking about, old man. Don't I? I've watched you these past weeks. First time since I've known you that you've seemed like more than just a shell of a man going through the motions of living. Frank's weathered face softened. Take it from someone who's lost more than he's kept in this life. Sometimes the risk is worth taking. Before Declan could respond, the bunkhouse door flew open. Olivia stood in the entrance, her eyes bright with unshed tears and anger. May I speak with Mr. Burke alone? She asked, her voice taut with control. The other hands quickly made themselves scarce, Frank giving Declan a pointed look as he passed. When they were alone, Olivia advanced on him, stopping just out of reach. So this is your answer? To run away without even a conversation. There's nothing to discuss, Declan said, forcing himself to meet her gaze. Porter can give you the life you deserve. The life I deserve? Her voice rose slightly. And who are you to decide what I deserve, Declan Burke? I'm nobody, he admitted. Just a hand who's overstayed his welcome. Look at me, Olivia demanded when he turned back to his packing. Look at me and tell me that what happened between us today meant nothing to you. Declan closed his eyes briefly, gathering the strength to do what he believed was right. It was a pleasant day, nothing more. The lie hung between them, heavy and poisonous. When he finally looked at her, the hurt in her eyes nearly broke his resolve. You're a coward, she said quietly. Worse than Samuel, because at least he was honest about his selfishness. You hide behind this idea that you're protecting me, when really you're only protecting yourself. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, she interrupted. You're afraid. Afraid of needing someone. Afraid of being needed. Afraid that if you stay, you might have to face the possibility of loss again someday. She took a step closer. But that's what living is, Declan. It's taking the risk because the alternative is merely existing. Her words struck with devastating accuracy, piercing the armor he'd worn for so long. And what happens when the risk doesn't pay off? He asked, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't suppress. What happens when you lose everything you care about, and you're left with nothing but the knowledge that you'll never be whole again? Understanding softened Olivia's expression. Is that what you think happened to you? That losing your family's homestead somehow broke you beyond repair. I know it did, he admitted. I've been half a man ever since. Olivia closed the distance between them, placing her hand on his chest, directly over his heart. This feels whole to me, she said softly. Wounded, perhaps, but still capable of healing. Still capable of love. The touch of her hand undid him. Declan covered it with his own, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. I have nothing to offer you, Olivia. No land, no future, no security. I'm not asking for those things, she replied. I'm asking for your heart, imperfect as it may be. I'm asking for your trust, your partnership. The rest we can build together. And Porter, Declan couldn't help asking. A flash of anger crossed her face. I sent Samuel away the moment you left. Did you really think I would consider his offer? After everything. Hope, that dangerous emotion he'd denied himself for so long, flickered to life inside Declan. Your father, my father has no right to negotiate my future without my consent, Olivia said firmly. I am not a piece of property to be traded for respectability or security. Declan's free hand reached up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. You deserve better than a wandering cowboy with nothing but his saddle and the clothes on his back. That's for me to decide, she replied. And I've decided I want the man who looked at me on those church steps and saw strength where others saw only humiliation. The man who makes me feel brave enough to ride into a gunfight, foolish as that may have been. Her lips curved into a tentative smile. The man who said their loss is my greatest fortune and made me believe, for the first time since Samuel left me, that perhaps something better was waiting. Declan's resistance crumbled entirely. Pulling Olivia close, he kissed her with all the emotion he'd spent years denying. Fear and hope, longing and need, and beneath it all, the beginning of love. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I can't promise it will be easy, he warned. I've spent a long time running. I'm not sure I remember how to stay. Then we'll learn together, Olivia replied. Day by day, if that's what it takes. A throat cleared from the doorway. They turned to find Carson watching them, his expression unreadable. Uncle William, Olivia began, stepping back from Declan but keeping hold of his hand. Carson held up a hand to forestall her explanation. I've just had a most interesting conversation with your father, he said. It seems he's quite convinced Porter is still the best match for you, despite the circumstances. Declan's heart sank, but Olivia's grip on his hand tightened. With all due respect to my father, she said firmly, I disagree. To their surprise, Carson smiled. So I told him. Quite forcefully, in fact. He turned his attention to Declan. Burke, I've been meaning to speak with you about a proposition. My foreman's retiring come fall, and I need someone who knows horses and men to take his place. Declan stared at him in disbelief. Sir, the position comes with the use of the old cabin by the Eastern Creek. It needs work, but it's solid. Room enough for a man to start a family, should he be so inclined. Carson's eyes twinkled as he glanced between them. Just something to consider. With that, he tipped his hat and left them alone again. Did he just? Declan began, unable to process what had just happened. Offer you a permanent position and a home of our own. Olivia finished, her eyes bright with joy. I believe he did. The possibility of a future, a real future with roots and purpose and love, stretched before Declan like a sunrise over the plains. For the first time since he was 16, he allowed himself to embrace hope without fear. What do you think? He asked softly, searching her face. Could you be happy with a foreman instead of a merchant's son? Living in a cabin instead of a fine house in town? Olivia's answer was to wrap her arms around his neck and kiss him soundly. I think, she said when they parted, that what others considered their loss truly has become my greatest fortune. 3 months later, on a perfect summer evening, Olivia James became Olivia Burke in a simple ceremony on the porch of the cabin they had spent weeks renovating together. Unlike her previous wedding day, this one brought only joy and certainty. Carson stood proudly in place of her father, who had refused to attend what he termed a foolish mistake. The ranch hands served as enthusiastic witnesses, Frank beaming like a proud uncle as he offered the first toast to the newlyweds. As twilight settled over the land, Declan and Olivia stood together on their porch, watching the first stars appear in the Wyoming sky. Any regrets? Declan asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Olivia leaned her head against his shoulder. Only that it took being left at the altar to lead me to you. Their loss, Declan quoted softly, my greatest fortune. Our fortune, Olivia corrected, turning in his arms to face him. This life we're building together, it's more than I ever dreamed possible. Declan looked at the woman who had taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that connection wasn't just pain waiting to happen. The woman who had shown him that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was to stay and build something lasting. I love you, Olivia Burke, he said, the words no longer frightening but liberating. And I love you, Declan Burke, she replied, her eyes reflecting the starlight and promise of all their tomorrows. Now and always. As they sealed their promise with a kiss, Declan finally understood the truth that had eluded him for so long. Home wasn't a place to be found or lost. It was a feeling, a connection, a choice made each day to open your heart despite the risks. And in Olivia's arms, beneath the vast Wyoming sky, Declan Burke had finally found his way home.